go into this long underground tunnel that leads into a big underground labyrinth.
This place has never been a refuge for ordinary people. Its main strategic purpose was to serve as a control center for the entire Soviet Union in the event of a nuclear war.
Investigators forced open a Cold War bunker that had been sealed for over 40 years. What they found inside stopped them cold. The air was still. Nothing had been touched.
That somebody wanted to come underground and hide something very valuable from something very terrible.
It was as if someone had just stepped out, but never returned. There were no signs of decay, no explanation for the sudden abandonment.
Oh, generator room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything remained perfectly preserved, yet no records mentioned what happened there. Whatever this facility was used for, someone clearly wanted it forgotten. And now it was finally exposed. The forgotten Soviet command bunkers. When investigators finally opened the sealed doors of Cold War bunkers under Moscow in 1996, what they saw left them frozen in place. The rooms weren't destroyed or crumbling. They were still intact, maps on the walls, phones on desks, radios ready to transmit. These were not ordinary bomb shelters. They were part of a massive secret project built by the Soviet Union, starting in the 1930s under Joseph Stalin. Hidden beneath Moscow and other key cities, these bunkers were designed for one terrifying purpose: to help Soviet leaders stay alive and in control during nuclear war. One of the largest and most famous of these is Bunker 42, also called the Tagansky Command Center. It lies 65 meters underground, about 20 stories deep. Inside are tunnels, war rooms, communication centers, air filtration systems, water tanks, food storage, and even sleeping quarters. Everything needed to run the country while the world above burned. It could keep hundreds of people alive for months without ever going to the surface. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, it's believed that Soviet leaders used Bunker 42 to prepare for a full nuclear exchange. Missiles were ready, orders were written, and war could have started from deep below Moscow without warning. Thankfully, that war never came. Another mystery is Metro 2, a secret underground railway system that may connect the Kremlin, secret bunkers, and even airports.
Look at this.
Former Soviet officials and U.S. intelligence reports claim it exists, but Russia has never confirmed it. Some say it stretches for miles under the city. Some even believe it's still in use today. As investigators explored these places, they found rooms full of Cold War equipment: old typewriters, encrypted radios, classified documents, backup power systems, and thick steel blast doors that could shut the outside world out completely. In one bunker, the phones still had direct lines to the Kremlin. In another, maps showed missile targets marked across Europe and the United States. These discoveries were shocking, but what they mean is even more disturbing. These bunkers weren't built just to hide in. They were command posts, made to direct war from underground. While civilians had little to no protection, the leadership had everything they needed to survive and to fight back. But here's what's terrifying. Most citizens had no idea any of this existed. People lived and worked right above these secret war centers, with no clue that a hidden government was preparing for the end of the world just beneath their feet. Today, some of these bunkers have been turned into museums. Others remain sealed. A few might still be active. But the truth is this: the Soviet Union was ready to run an entire war from underground. They planned every detail. They practiced for nuclear disaster, and they never told the public. East German Stasi bunkers. Hidden beneath the forests and suburbs of East Germany, the secret bunkers of the Stasi, the state security police, still exist.
Hidden in the forests of East Germany.
This bunker was actually discovered here by chance.
These underground compounds were not just fallout shelters, they were command centers for a police state built on fear. Inside, investigators found sealed interrogation rooms, padded holding cells, stacks of surveillance tapes, and instruction manuals for psychological operations. Everything was still there, untouched, since the regime collapsed in 1989.
Of course, after the war, explosives were not available in the quantities that would have been needed. You have to understand that. The war was over, and they used the leftover explosives they had.
In one bunker near Leipzig, a reinforced steel door led to a chamber where prisoners were kept without sunlight for weeks. The cells had no windows, just concrete walls and soundproof padding. Fluorescent lights stayed on at all hours to break down sleep cycles. Audio systems piped in white noise to prevent communication between detainees. On one wall, guards had scribbled codes for enhanced isolation treatments. These included sensory deprivation, forced nudity, and humiliation drills designed to make prisoners confess, truthfully or not. Further inside, investigators found files on ordinary citizens, tens of thousands of them. Many were targeted just for criticizing the government in private conversations. The Stasi used hidden microphones in homes, offices, even inside teddy bears and electrical sockets. Everything was recorded and filed. In one room, stacked floor to ceiling, were detailed reports on children who had been ordered to secretly gather information on their parents. Some were as young as 10 years old. Radio equipment remained intact, still tuned to emergency frequencies that would have gone live if East Germany had gone to war. These weren't meant for public safety. They were systems to coordinate mass arrests, population lockdowns, and roundups of subversives in the event of civil unrest or NATO invasion. Plans existed to detain entire neighborhoods. Officers had pre-written lists of targets to be arrested within 24 hours. One bunker outside Berlin had a fully operational command room with color-coded maps showing sectors of Berlin divided by threat level. Alongside these maps were plans for rerouting train traffic, shutting down communication lines, and cutting electricity in designated high-risk zones. It was a blueprint for silencing a population in a matter of hours. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a cache of training materials. These were manuals on interrogation, mind control, and psychological warfare. One file described how to stage fake family deaths to break a prisoner's mental state. Another detailed how to release detainees after long-term isolation in ways that would make them paranoid, fragile, and easier to monitor outside prison. These bunkers were not built to protect people from war. They were built to protect the regime from its own people. Every hallway, every cell, every switch was part of a system designed to control the minds and bodies of civilians. The horror was not just in the surveillance or the arrests. It was in the planning, the careful, calculated effort to turn fear into a science.
Because it's cold in the bunker. 9 degrees, summer and winter. Now we have a 2.5-ton steel door.
Today, the bunkers sit empty, but the files, the wiring, and the rooms remain. What happened inside them was real, and so was the system that allowed it to exist. U.S. nuclear launch facilities. When investigators entered an abandoned Titan II missile silo in Arizona, one of several decommissioned after the Cold War, they were met with a sight that felt like walking into a frozen war plan.
A place that's purpose was deterrence and mutually assured destruction. We're in Green Valley, Arizona, and we're visiting the Titan Missile Museum.
The rusted missile launch control panel stood at the center, once capable of delivering a nuclear warhead across continents. Its switches were locked in place by years of corrosion. The protective glass covers had shattered and fallen to the floor. This was the command center from which 2 trained personnel, using a strict launch protocol, could have turned twin keys to initiate global destruction. These silos were not symbolic defenses. They were real instruments of war, placed on high alert around the clock. Inside this particular silo, investigators found operations logs left behind, detailing constant drills and readiness procedures. Crews lived underground for days at a time, prepared to launch without hesitation. What disturbed investigators most was how routine it had all become. They reviewed reports of psychological conditioning used on missileers, including sleep drills where crews were suddenly woken up and told to run launch steps within 60 seconds. In isolation drills, teams were locked underground for days with no contact from the outside world. Some drills made them practice launch commands in total silence to train them to follow orders without hesitation or emotion. Even when they knew it was just practice, they had to go through every step like it was real. One former officer recalled how his team once received a false warning and fully prepared to launch, believing World War III had begun. That mistake was corrected with only seconds to spare. Had it not been, millions would have died.
While the opponents argue that nuclear proliferation increases the chances of a nuclear war.
These sites were designed to fire, not to ask questions. The launch crews were trained not just to follow orders, but to suppress the emotional cost of what they were doing. To do this, they were put through mental conditioning. They were taught to see launching the missile as just another job. They were told that any delay could lead to the country being destroyed. Some were even made to write down how many people would die in a real strike, then still go through the launch steps like normal. The goal was to make sure that when the order came, they wouldn't hesitate, panic, or question what they were about to do. When investigators saw the emergency cots, still set up with rotting blankets and iodine tablets, they realized these crews were expected to survive underground after launching nuclear missiles that would have incinerated entire cities. The terror of the Cold War was not just in the weapons, it was in the cold precision and psychological brutality of the system itself. British Cold War shelters. The air inside Britain's Cold War shelters was still heavy with decay long after the doors were sealed. In places like Kelvedon Hatch in Essex, Corsham's Burlington Bunker, and Hack Green in Cheshire, investigators walked through corridors built to outlast nuclear fire. What they found was far worse than ruins. These sites weren't just shelters. They were evidence of a government plan that had quietly accepted mass civilian death.
In the event of an attack, the Queen and the government would have been dissolved of power.
Rows of metal bunk beds lined the walls, stacked in tight formation, with the mattresses long since rotted away. These were not places to live. They were places to be stored. In Burlington, a vast underground complex meant to house the Prime Minister and 4,000 government staff. The reality was chilling. It had no space for civilians. Survival was never intended for the public. In sealed rooms marked BBC Emergency Broadcast, dust-covered microphones faced crumbling soundproof walls. These were the stations from which the last instructions would have been issued, messages pre-written to inform survivors how to bury their dead and wait for further orders. The voices would have sounded calm. The country outside would have been burning.
The hardest thing to repair after any disaster, whether it's natural or man-made, is the basic infrastructure.
The shelters also included radiation inspection chambers. At Kelvedon Hatch, investigators found narrow decontamination corridors with peeling paint and rusted Geiger counters. The purpose was simple. Anyone exposed to radiation had to be screened before entry. If found contaminated, they were to be denied access. No treatment, no second chances. Families would have been turned away at the door and left to die in the fallout. Stored alongside iodine tablets and gas masks were government-issued manuals describing post-strike sanitation procedures. In wartime broadcasting service plans, the public was told to make latrines out of buckets and dispose of corpses by wrapping them in plastic and placing them outside. No mention of rescue, only instructions to manage the decay. Investigators did not leave those bunkers shocked by the technology. They left horrified by the intent. The shelters told a clear story. If nuclear war had come, the government would have gone underground. Everyone else would have been left above to burn, to starve, or to choke on ash. Chernobyl's secret bunkers. Beneath the administrative building of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Soviet engineers constructed a Cold War-era command bunker. This underground facility was designed as a hardened control center where top-level plant management could operate in the event of war or disaster. When Reactor 4 exploded on April 26, 1986, this is where several key figures, including plant director Viktor Bryukhanov and senior engineers, retreated to manage the unfolding crisis. The bunker was sealed off from the outside by blast doors and buried deep enough to survive a nearby nuclear detonation. Inside, investigators later documented reinforced concrete walls, independent power sources, and outdated Soviet communication equipment still mounted to the walls. Some of the original switches, telephones, and radiation monitoring instruments remain intact. Reports from both Ukrainian and international researchers confirm that this was the hub from which early misinformation was relayed to Moscow, including the denial that the reactor core had exploded. The conditions inside were stark and purely functional. There were no amenities for comfort, just rows of steel desks, radiation maps, and monitoring consoles designed to survive chaos above. Some images published years later show Soviet gas masks stored in cabinets, though these were standard issue for facilities of this type and not unique to Chernobyl. The real horror is the role this bunker played during the worst nuclear disaster in history. It was here that critical decisions were made while radiation levels climbed outside.
Is the area radioactive and is dangerous for the pilot and for the team?
The men inside were not protected indefinitely. Many, including those stationed in this bunker, received high doses of radiation and later died from exposure. Today, the bunker is sealed and monitored. Its entrances are welded shut or buried under concrete and earth. Ukrainian authorities restrict access due to both contamination and structural risk. Canadian Diefenbunkers. Beneath a quiet patch of farmland in Carp, Ontario, investigators in 1997 stepped into what had once been one of Canada's most heavily guarded secrets. The Diefenbunker. Built in 1959 and completed in 1961.
The bunker was built to withstand a 5 megaton blast from a distance of as close as 1.8 kilometers away.
This underground facility was designed to keep the federal government functioning in the event of nuclear war. The first sign of what lay beneath came with the massive steel blast doors. Weighing over 5 tons, they were engineered to absorb the force of a near-miss nuclear detonation. When closed, they cut off the outside world completely. Investigators described the air as stale, dry, and unnaturally still, as if the building had been holding its breath since the Cold War. Inside, they found fully preserved operations rooms, long corridors lined with rusting filing cabinets, outdated radiation meters, and faded civil defense posters warning of fallout and contamination. Wall-sized maps of North America still marked projected Soviet missile trajectories. Rotary phones and switchboards sat ready for use, once intended to coordinate a national response in the first minutes of a nuclear exchange. The Prime Minister's suite remained intact, with a reinforced office, sleeping quarters, and communication lines. But it was the CBC emergency broadcast studio that drew the most attention. Microphones still faced soundproofed walls. It was here that the leader of Canada would have addressed a population dying in real time, announcing mass destruction from inside a sealed bunker.
This room was equipped with 2 Burroughs computers, which are responsible for transmitting about 100,000 messages per month.
The medical bay was small and bleak. Surgical tools, sealed cabinets, and instruction manuals for dealing with radiation burns were still on site. Investigators confirmed the presence of morgue drawers, functional cold storage units for those who died underground. There was no plan for long-term burial. The dormitories were built for endurance, not comfort. Triple-stacked bunks filled the narrow rooms, each with a blanket, a locker, and nothing else. Bathrooms and showers were designed for rotation. Everyone would have shared limited water under strict rations. The cafeteria held rows of trays and unopened ration containers, all marked with expiry dates from the 1970s and 1980s. One of the darkest discoveries was the war simulation data left behind on magnetic tapes and punched cards. These showed practice scenarios in which major cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal were struck by multiple warheads. In these simulations, millions died. Canada's leaders would have watched from this very facility, issuing orders and accepting outcomes from deep below the soil. Today, the site is preserved as a museum. The terror the Diefenbunker was built for never arrived, but the structure stands as a real and chilling reminder of how prepared Canada was to face the end. Nuclear testing bunkers in Nevada. Deep in the Nevada desert, a group of investigators entered old nuclear testing bunkers from the Cold War. The walls were scarred and burned by the heat of past explosions. In some areas, radiation meters still clicked softly, proving the ground still held traces of the deadliest tests in modern history. One of the first things they found was melted equipment. Metal consoles were twisted and deformed, almost like they had been turned to wax. It was easy to imagine the people who once worked here, watching their screens as nuclear fireballs exploded far away in the desert. Next, they found test logs. Piles of old files, their pages yellow and fragile, listed every test, every countdown, every blast size. Some were typed, others handwritten. Old gas masks also lay in corners, dry and cracking. They were from drills that trained people to survive an event few could have lived through. Rusty signs still said fallout shelter, but these places wouldn't have saved anyone. They were meant to give the illusion of safety while the world above turned to ash. The worst discovery was the damage from radiation.
So I'll set the meter on the 10,000 counts per minute scale.
Paint was peeling off ceilings, not from age, but from exposure. The walls had deep cracks, like they had been punched from the inside. Some areas were still unsafe. Radiation levels were so high that investigators had to leave parts of the bunker. Being inside these rooms felt like entering a nightmare from history. These weren't just bunkers. They were testing grounds for the end of the world. Eastern European submarine bunkers. In Albania near Porto Palermo, investigators entered a mountain that had been completely hollowed out to hide submarines. Inside, they found vast concrete tunnels built to survive nuclear strikes. The blast doors were meters thick. The air was heavy with rust and old fuel. These were not shelters. They were war launch platforms. In Ukraine, the Balaclava base revealed worse. Buried under rock and hidden from local residents, it had been one of the Soviet Union's most secret nuclear submarine facilities. Investigators walked through cold tunnels where control rooms still held switches, maps, and targeting dials. Nothing had been cleared. The war plans were still sitting there. Radiation shielding covered the walls. Its thickness confirmed what had once been inside. Submarines armed with nuclear warheads. Some rooms still smelled like fuel. Machines had rotted where they stood. The place had been ready for a doomsday order. In the dry docks, investigators found massive submarine bays stretching into darkness. They were large enough to hold multiple vessels, each capable of triggering mass death. These bunkers were not just relics. They were reminders that global destruction had once been one command away, and no one would have seen it coming. Biological warfare labs. Deep inside Kazakhstan, investigators stepped into sealed Soviet bunkers that had once housed one of the most terrifying programs of the Cold War, biological weapons research. The moment they entered, the silence was overwhelming, broken only by the echo of their footsteps. And then, the discoveries began. Rows of rusted cages stood in the dark, their bars twisted and corroded. These were not cages for small experiments. Many were large enough to hold goats, monkeys, even dogs. Each one told a chilling story. Animals had been used as test subjects, deliberately exposed to deadly pathogens. The smell of chemicals still lingered, decades after the program had been abandoned. Investigators found sealed steel doors leading into laboratories where vials once stored weaponized anthrax, plague, and smallpox strains. Walls bore heavy markings of containment warnings in Russian, now faded but unmistakable. One room revealed piles of protective suits, brittle with age, some stained and torn. The implication was clear. Something had gone wrong here. The records uncovered were even worse. Test logs described entire colonies of animals dying within hours, followed by chilling notes on efficiency and deployment potential. The Soviets had not just experimented, they had refined biological weapons intended for battlefield use. Imagine the fear. If these pathogens had ever leaked, entire towns could have vanished within days. And the shocking truth? Some samples were never accounted for. Even after official cleanups, experts admitted that certain strains might still lie buried in these bunkers, sealed in forgotten containers, waiting to be disturbed. Today, those sealed chambers remain off-limits to the public. Researchers warn that without full excavation and containment, these forgotten weapons could still pose a danger. What was once a Cold War secret is now a silent threat, one buried deep underground and still not fully understood. What do you think about these discoveries? Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.